I was reading a report from the Congressional Budget Office. In the report, they stated that the Iraq War is estimated to have cost $2.4 trillion dollars. That is estimated to have cost each U.S. citizen $6,300. Imagine if we could have taken that money and built a modern rail system, gave every American health insurance, paid for education. There are many better ways we could have spent that money rather than the invasion itself. The cost wasn't just monetary, however. Think of the millions of lives of the Iraqi civilians who died, the thousands of soldiers who died, the soldiers who came back home without limbs, the soldiers who committed suicide due to PTSD from the war. All of that aside, it made the situation in Iraq worse. Now, Saddam was a bad guy. He was a tyrant. But the region was stable due to him being a tyrant. Once Saddam was deposed of, removed from power, the US made a lot of mistakes. The first is that they thought they could bring Western style democracy to Iraq. Right before Saddam was killed, when he was being interrogated by the CIA, he said something that was very prophetic. He told the member of the CIA that they were going to fail. They didn't know the history of Iraq, and they didn't know the language. Trying to go into that region and bring a Western style democracy wasn't feasible, wasn't going to happen. Even historically speaking, if you look at the history of the region, which you think these idiots would have done before they invaded, you think they would have at least went on Wikipedia, Fakepedia I call it, and looked up some of the basic bullet points. Iraq wasn't really homogenous. It wasn't really organized into a stable region for most of its history. In the beginning, you had the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers. And you had all of these different governments that were fighting over the region. For a period of time, you had the Sumerians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the New Babylonian Empire, the Mongols, the Persians, the Greeks. Historically speaking, though, unlike Western-style democracies who don't want a dictator, this region preferred having a strong man control it. Whether that was Hammurabi, Nebuchadnezzar, Sargon of Akkad, Alexander the Great, the Romans, Darius, Cyrus, and a plethora of others. The state, historically speaking, was better off when it was controlled by a strong dictator. When eventually it was conquered by the Ottomans, they stumbled into World War I. After the war, the British took over Iraq, and in 1953, it became independent. Now, before I get into Saddam Hussein, let me preface my statement. Saddam was a tyrant. Saddam was evil. He was ruthless. He wasn't a good guy at all. When it comes to power, you gotta ask yourself, compared to what? What's better? What Iraq has now, which we will get into as I dissect more, or what they had under Saddam. I'm simply comparing his government to what they have currently and what they had after him. Saddam ended up becoming vice president. It's interesting that the U.S. Embassy and Saddam made contact with one another during this time. It's hypothesized that the U.S. and Saddam had mutual interest in that they helped him take power. Eventually, Saddam and the Ba'ath Party purged their enemies. You can find the clip on YouTube. It's an old television clip in black and white. Saddam becomes the leader after being vice president. The president steps down. The backstory on that is that Saddam had the president's wife and kids in prison and told him if he didn't step down and give the presidency to Saddam, he was going to butcher his wife and kids and rip them limb from limb, something to that extent. So the president stepped down, and that is when Saddam ascended into power. Eventually, Saddam wanted to increase his power over the people. There's also another famous story, some people think it's a legend, that Saddam had one of his best friends killed. The story goes that his wife, not Saddam's wife, but his friend's wife, told Saddam that she wanted him to come home. Saddam agreed to the demand. However, when he sent his friend home, he was cut off into multiple pieces. There's another story that Saddam had people in his government blindfolded. He put them on a bus and they were going around Baghdad, the capital of Iraq. Eventually, they left the bus and they were taken to the palace where Saddam gave them wine, a big meal, and then $1,000 cash. He did this because he wanted to show them who was in charge and that he could be very gracious, very benevolent, but he could also be tough. There's also another famous story that the guy who married Saddam's daughter, he had two daughters, but one of the guys wanted to become the leader. He ended up getting asylum in Syria, and Saddam told his daughters, if you bring him back, I will let him live. But of course, he had him killed. The point is, Saddam was the man in charge. People knew that if they rose up against him, he would have them brutally executed, and even sometimes members of their families. That's why ISIS and other militant Islamic groups had no chance of ever taking over that region while Saddam was in power, due to Saddam's brutality and domineering nature. The next big event worth noting is the Iraq-Iran War. Saddam wanted to continue his dominance of his country. He was also afraid because Iran just had a coup where their leader was removed. Due to all of these things transpiring, Saddam decided that he would want to get some of that territory, regain some of that territory. Iraq has 6 countries that border it, and one of them is Iran, so they're natural rivals. The war lasted for 8 years, and nobody gained anything of substance. Yet, thousands of lives were lost. What's interesting to note about this particular war is that the United States and a lot of the West supported Saddam simply because they hated Iran more. It's similar to them supporting the Soviet Union in World War II against Hitler. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. That's how the saying goes. In the official congressional record, you can look up all of the congressional record online, any of them you want to see. The U.S. government actually gave Saddam aid. They gave him chemical weapons. They gave him anthrax. And they also helped him start his weapons program. Saddam also used U.S. intelligence against Iran and used chemical weapons against civilians with the U.S.'s compliance and help. Even in parts of Iran to this day, there are still generations of citizens born with birth defects from that conflict. After the Iraq-Iran War, the major domino to fall that began the downfall of Saddam was the Gulf War. This is the first domino that fell. Due to the war effort, Iraq owed Kuwait money that they couldn't pay. They also claimed that Kuwait was over flooding the oil market. 99.9% of all Iraq's exports is oil, even to the present day. And Saddam claimed that Kuwait was over flooding the market. The U.S. actually met with Saddam. Saddam assumed, since the U.S. supported him during the Iraq-Iran war, that they wouldn't do anything about him going against Kuwait. However, during their meeting, they said something, and like the U.S. government always does, they went back on their word. They stated, "I don't care about Arab and Arab conflicts. I prefer a diplomatic solution, but you can figure this out how you want." Something to that extent. And the WikiLeaks even showed that George Bush, Sr. at the time, had direct contact with Saddam right before the war began. If Saddam knew that he would have a big drawback from the West, I'm not sure if he would have continued the current course of action. He invaded Kuwait. Now, here's the interesting part about that. There was a testimony from a girl named Naira who claimed that the Iraqi soldiers were putting babies in incubators and letting them die on the floor. This was one of the stated reasons by President Bush why the U.S. decided to intervene. What's interesting about this is that this was a total lie. Naira actually was the daughter of the U.S. of the Kuwait ambassador to the United States. It was a lie. It was war propaganda. It was a false premise, and due to this, the United States decided to intervene in Kuwait. It was actually a public relations firm that caused this propaganda to be spread. As a result, you had soldiers that died, Iraqi civilians that died, people in Kuwait that died. After that happened, the U.S. wanted to get Saddam removed from power. However, Dick Cheney was actually astute in his estimation of why they didn't do it. He knew that if you remove Saddam, for some reason he knew this back in 1994 when he was interviewed, but he seemed to be willfully ignorant, or maybe some malfeasance on his part. I'm not a mind reader, I don't know. He stated something to the extent of, if you get rid of Saddam, you have the Shiites and the Sunnis and the Kurds who are going to try to take power from Saddam. And who knows if that can be a stable government? You're going to have all this infighting.